So I'm Miranda, and I am coming to you from the nature wonderland that is my backyard, so I'll apologize ahead of time for all of the birds. But I have made a few videos in the past showing some of the two-stroke vintage mopeds that I have in my collection, and I recently picked up this bike in the fall, and I've been riding it pretty regularly ever since then. And so one of the experiences I had with buying this bike was it was very difficult to find honest information on the internet about what to expect if I were to buy the bike. And so I wanted to make a very just normal person review of my experience with the bike, kind of show what it is and what it does and how it works, so that anybody out there that's considering picking this bike up has a good, accurate understanding of what to expect and anticipate. So, like I said, this is the ONYX RCR. It is a 6,000 watt electric, what I would classify as a moped. ONYX tends to call it a motorbike or an electric motorbike. I think that's a pretty accurate representation of what it is. It's not truly a full-blown motorcycle. You know, this bike reaches a top speed of about 50 miles an hour. But it also isn't really an e-bicycle either. You know, it has pedals and can be pedaled like a bicycle, but it's not really a realistic scenario to be pedaling a bike like this. For one, it's very heavy. It's around 120 to 130 pounds, if I remember correctly. And so the pedals are really just there for legal classification, depending on the state or country you might be registering this bike in. I live in the state of Michigan, and so the rules here are a little wishy-washy, so it's always hard to know exactly how to classify these bikes. So I encourage people to read your own state laws on mopeds, electric bicycles, and motorcycles, and come up with what you think is the right solution for how you need to register your bike personally. I actually bought this bike used. So this bike was actually purchased by one of the original backers on the project on Kickstarter, and he had the bike for, I'd say, 3 to 4 months, and eventually decided to get rid of it. I caught him on the internet kind of talking about the bike and reached out to him to ask some of my own questions because I was looking at ordering, and he confessed that he was looking to save some money to buy a car and that he didn't know if he was going to be riding the bike as much as he thought he would, and so I offered to just pick it up from him. But this was definitely one of the earlier builds for the bike, so there might be some differences on my bike that aren't existent in the bikes that you would buy now new. Another thing I want to point out is I've had this bike, like I said, through the winter, and so over the winter I actually brought it down into the basement of my home and worked on it and made some changes and modifications. So the modifications that I've made in that time have been adding these side view mirrors. The bike does not come standard with any mirrors. I've actually added this turn signal setup here on the fork headlight frame brackets, and I've also swapped out the headlight for a new headlight. The original headlight, while it worked fine, and it is an LED headlight and it was pretty bright, I actually just kind of wanted the look of a bigger, larger headlight and the functionality of having a brighter headlight. So this headlight is a 5.5-inch headlight that's a lot brighter than the stock headlight on the ONYX, and then I put this grille on it purely out of aesthetics. Other changes I've made to the bike, the graphics are my own, so the bike actually comes with just the plain brushed metal on the side. I've added a phone bracket here. I carry my phone with me and I use Google Maps and bicycle directions to get around town here in Detroit, so I have that added. And then I have swapped out the rear forks, mostly for aesthetics, but also just wanted a little bit of a better bounce to the back of the bike, but they're the same size in terms of the length as the bike. So you can see I'm about a 5'9" person. I have pretty long legs. So you can see in relation to me how big the bike is. And then finally, the only other main thing I've changed is I swapped out the pedals. The original pedals are plastic. I believe they're Wellgo brand pedals. Totally fine pedals. Again, I was just kind of looking for this kind of gold and black look, so that's what I put on there. The bike that I have has the optional rack that you can order for it. The rack is actually really short. The rack stops right about here, so it's really only maybe 8 inches long. Not a whole heck of a lot of room to hold much of anything, but so what I ended up doing is I found this awesome rack. It's made by Thule, and it is called the Pack and Pedal Basket. It's actually made for bicycles, and it is compatible with all of their bicycle racks that they make, but it has this cool universal channel system, and that universal channel system allowed me to customize the fit to this rack, and it's essentially, you know, doubled the length of my rack. And then now it's also given me a great place I can grab this and use this to maneuver the bike around when I'm parking it somewhere or whatever. It's a really sturdy basket, so I've filled it with groceries and whatnot. It holds up really well. And then I normally have a big bungee net that I throw over the top of it and hook on to hold anything in that I'm carrying. And that's been really awesome. So I highly recommend this basket. I have a lot of people ask me about this basket, and I've just been really, really fond of it. It's definitely not cheap. I think it was $60 or $70, but it's really well made. It's a really good quality basket, and I've just had a really good experience using it. So I definitely recommend it if you're somebody who wants to carry things. I've owned a fair number of mopeds in my lifetime and have been riding mopeds for about 10 years or so now. And so this bike really exceeded my expectations off the bat. It is incredibly fast compared to a conventional two-stroke moped. So I would definitely encourage anybody who does not have any bike experience to be really careful on a bike like this. It is really quick on the line. It is absolutely capable of pulling a wheelie, and especially because the bike has so much weight in the rear with the motor on the rear wheel. If you're sitting too far back and you pull the throttle, you'll find that if you pull it a little too quickly, or if you're not really paying attention to how you're feathering it, you can kick up. And so just something to keep in mind. This bike definitely, if you're a first timer with something on two wheels, it's definitely going to feel really aggressive and powerful. So I encourage whoever is on it to be very careful, because it is really quick and powerful. I believe the 0 to 60 time is 0 to 30 time is somewhere around 4 seconds, and that it feels even faster than that from my experience. I'm sure it is accurate, and I'm sure that's an accurate number, but at least from my experience with other small displacement bikes, 50 to 70 cc bikes, this thing is really quick off the line. So it very much is that electric instant torque feeling that you get from like a Tesla. Right out of the gate, some of the problems that I've found with this bike, some of the design flaws that I think people should be aware of. If you're not a handy person, this might not be the bike for you. If you're looking for a turnkey, I buy this, I don't do any maintenance, I don't do any tweaking, there are some things about this bike that are definitely a little, what I would call like Frankenstein or homemade, which is part of why I love it. I do like tinkering and working on bikes, and this kind of offers a little bit of that feeling without having the overall maintenance problems of a two-stroke motor. So some examples of that would be the top case. So the top cover is like a molded bamboo cover. This basically just sits right on top and is locked with a simple key. And what I found is that this piece wants to slide forward and back, which is fine. A little movement is understandable. But I have found that, at least on mine, sometimes when it slides forward, it actually will kick over. And so when it kicks over, now it's basically loose. And I have to pull it back on, and this will happen while I'm riding. So, I have my knee on either side of this thing, and as I'm turning and riding, sometimes I find that I actually force it forward and then therefore off. So that's a little bit of a frustration point. I think that's a simple fix. If I just added, a bracket or two on the sides here, I think that would prevent that from happening in the future, but something to keep in mind. It's not perfect. This bamboo cover, while it's really cool aesthetically, and I really do like it overall, it is a bitch to take off. It is such a tight squeeze between the handlebars, the frame, and the seat that getting this thing on and off is really cumbersome. You have to shimmy it back and forth, teeter-totter it in and out, and then eventually we'll get it to kind of pop off. And so because that's the only way to charge the bike stock, I definitely would recommend really quickly buying a few upgrades. The upgrade that I ended up doing was actually installing a external charging port. Basically it's just an extension. So it's a female plug that plugs onto the male plug that comes off the battery, and it's just a lengthener. So I actually just ran that through the bike into the frame. It didn't require me to drill anything, which was nice. And it actually comes out under the seat now, and you can see down here maybe is this charge port. So basically I just put an extension cord on it, and now when I want to charge, I simply reach under the seat, grab that, plug it in. That's worked really well for me, and so I don't really intend on doing anything more than that as far as charging goes. The bike, at least right now on their site, doesn't come with turn signals, but it does come with the turn signal controls on your handlebars. So this winter, like I said, I installed my own turn signals. I purchased these turn signals really cheaply off AliExpress. They're just LED. I think I got them for $6 or $8. And then I ended up, drilling a hole into this bracket, screwing them in place, and then had to wire it to the bike myself. I had a friend who is an electrical engineer help me do this because I really don't know a whole lot about electrical work. I also took the opportunity to tape up the alarm system. There is an alarm system on the bike, which is super great to have. I do really like it, but it is so ungodly loud that it is impossible for somebody like me who lives in a quiet neighborhood to lock the bike at night and not feel like I am pissing my neighbors off. So I actually took the opportunity while I was in there to take that alarm, and I just covered it with a couple pieces of foam and duct taped it. So it still works, it's still loud, it's still totally audible, but it's not that like brain busting, insanely screechy loud noise anymore. One thing that you'll hear a lot of people talk about if you follow any of the ONYX like Facebook groups or forums, the front brake, at least on the early build bikes, the brake caliper can actually warp over time, which can cause uneven brake pad wear and some squeaking. This is something that, from what I understand, ONYX has fixed in former builds, so I don't believe that's a problem anymore, and I actually ordered that same new caliper to put on my bike, but I haven't done that yet. Some of the other fit and finish problems that I've noticed, because of the way that this case comes off, it actually can very easily scrape the seat. The seat is obviously not a real leather, it's kind of a plastic material, and so when you're pulling that cover off, it actually does scrape the corners of the seat, and I have some wear on both sides of the seat now, where that material has worn off because of taking the top on and off so often. I've pretty much stopped taking the top of the case off now since I have that rear access port, so I don't think it's going to really become too much of a problem in the future. But another thing for somebody to keep an eye on, this is something that hasn't changed in any of the new builds of the bike, so that fit and finish can be kind of frustrating, just because you buy a bike, you spend a lot of money, you expect some of these things to not happen, but you also have to recognize that this is basically a really small startup and a really a homemade thing for all intents and purposes. And so for me, I'm okay with some of these things because the overall functionality, speed, and then aesthetic for me, value for money, is just amazing with this bike. There's nothing really out there in terms of competition that I would say is hitting all of these points in just the right amount of way with that little bit of secret sauce. As long as you're willing to deal with a couple little issues here and there, a couple little, inaccuracies in some of the tolerances, I think just about everybody would be really, really happy with this bike. Again, just something to keep in mind if you're a new rider, this is a really powerful bike. It's no joke. It's not a scooter. It's not a 50cc scooter. I mean, this is probably equivalent to somewhere around 150cc motorcycle. And when you combine that with the torque of the electric motor, this can very quickly become a dangerous bike if you don't know what you're doing. So I would definitely make sure that you either have experience or take some classes or go get your motorcycle license, even if you don't need it in your state. Just because having those skills on a bike with this much torque, I think, is really important. As it stands now, the bike doesn't come with fenders. That's been a bit of a challenge for me, as I've had a hard time finding fenders that will fit. There are a couple Tomos tires that I've heard out there that you can buy on Treatland and other places that are at least close to compatible and only require a small amount of adjustment in order to fit. But I don't really like the aesthetic of them. It kind of breaks down this whole cool kind of futuristic look. So, so far I've just sort of opted to go without. But I can see if you were looking for some fenders, it could be a little bit of a challenge to find something that fits and looks really good. And doesn't require a lot of modification to do so. So again, if you're looking to do some of these changes, if you do want the fenders, if you do want the turn signals, if you do want that better headlight, these aren't things that are very plug and play. They definitely take some level of understanding and knowledge of how these bikes go together. Some little bit of handiness, needs to come into play. So for the average first timer who's never picked up a 10mm wrench before, this might not be good for you unless you have a friend or a resource around you that can help you do some of these modifications. One of the big things that I see a couple people complaining about on the internet about this bike is the half throttle that the bike has. So instead of the throttle being the full width of your hand on the handlebar, it's actually only half. So you have this sort of stationary portion that doesn't twist, and then you have this half twist portion. And so because of that, it really requires you to feather very carefully. And because it's that half twist, you really can only control it with your thumb and first two fingers before you're sort of into the zone of the non-turnable part of the throttle. So it does require a lot of very micro twist movements when you're operating it. It would be nice if it could be a little less touchy, but it's also understandable that this is just a really fast electric bike, and so you have to be really careful with it. On that throttle, there's a 3-button controller that allows you to oscillate between an eco mode, a standard mode, and a sport mode. The eco mode limits the bike to about 20 miles an hour, if I remember correctly. It's either 15 or 20. The normal mode limits it to about 30 or 35, and the sport mode is basically the full tilt power of the bike as it comes. So I typically leave it when I'm riding in the normal mode. That allows me to get around Detroit really easily. And then if I ever have an issue, if I have somebody riding my ass on the road, or if I'm trying to get out of the way of something really quickly, or if I need to pass somebody, I'll throw it into sport quick and I'll zoom around them. That's something about this bike that I really like in comparison to some of the other competitor bikes out there, like the vintage electric, is some of these have modes that can only be changed when the bike is stationary. And so it's really nice with this bike that I can just in motion go from normal to sport and then back to normal. I don't have to stop the bike to make those changes. I just hit the switch and go. The bike does come with a key fob. I actually believe it comes with two. It's kind of ugly, looks like this, but it allows you to lock the bike, unlock the bike, and turn on your alarm, things like that. It's actually kind of nice to have. It's nice that I actually don't carry my lock with me all the time. If I know I'm just running an errand and I'm just gonna hop in a store and hop out, I'll just simply lock the bike and leave. People can hear the audible chirp a lot like a BMW, and so they know that I've engaged some kind of alarm system. I can walk in, do my grocery run, come back out, and I don't have to really worry about a lock for those small trips. Some of the worst parts of the bike that I would talk about would be the gauge cluster. The gauge cluster is clearly just an aftermarket part. I actually think there's a couple early zero motorcycles that use the same speedometer. It is not bright at all, so it's really hard to see during the daytime. It scratches really easily. I've seen a lot of people buying iPhone screen protectors and cutting them to fit so that they're protecting the screen, because it does mar very easily. And if it's not at the exact right angle, it is almost impossible to read, if not impossible to read. After installing this new bigger headlight, it's forcing my speedometer to sit up a little higher, so my angle is now almost impossible to read when I'm riding. Thankfully, the only time I'm really looking at the speedometer anymore is if I am checking my battery. So usually I'm doing that when I'm stationary. I can kind of lean back and get the right angle and see what I'm trying to look for, and I can make it work. The other thing that's a little confusing about the speedometer and whole little UI here is the battery indication. That's something that I have just learned getting into this with electric bikes, that you're not really paying attention to the bar. You know, it's not like your phone where you're watching that meter tick down and you're watching your little tick marks go down with your little battery symbol. It has that battery symbol, but you do not want to pay attention to that bar. You actually want to pay attention to the voltmeter above it. The voltage is telling you obviously how many volts are remaining in the battery. The bike is operating between 80 volts at full and then 60 volts at dead, which is something they don't really tell you. So when you get this bike and you look at the battery indicator, you're kind of like, okay, this number's ticking down, maybe it ticks down to 0, or it's kind of hard to tell. But really what ends up happening is as you get closer to 0, every time you start the bike from 0 to wherever you're going, your voltage is going to spike, and the closer you get to 60, the less of a spike it's going to allow before the motor shuts itself off in order to protect the integrity of the battery. So it will not let itself go below 60. So if, let's say, you're at 65 volts, you've been riding for 30 miles or so, and you are sitting at a light, the light turns green, and you jam on the the throttle, you might find that the bike just dies, and that's because you spiked below that 60. Whereas if you had just throttled it lightly, you can keep it above 60 and maintain the bike to keep going. So that's something with this bike that definitely, if you weren't experienced and you don't really know much about electrical stuff, could be really confusing and kind of scary. I have had it happen once or twice where I was riding home, I can tell I'm getting close to 60, I was getting nervous of whether I would make it all the way or not, and I was able to just baby it here, but that basically required me to be really, really intentional with how quick I was throttling up. I threw it into eco mode to make sure that I wasn't going too fast, and really just kept myself slow going to get to my destination. So if you do buy one of these bikes, make sure that you pay attention to that voltage, not the battery. The battery will tick down almost none and then basically just drop off super fast at the end when you're actually about to die. So you'll stare at it and be like, oh, I'm still at 75% of the dots are here, when really you're at half of your battery or less. So something to definitely be careful about. Another thing that was a little sketchy right out of the gate, so you have the motor back here, and the motor has what's called a phase wire that comes off the motor. This is the the wires that are giving power and control to the bike from your inputs on the throttle and whatnot. That wire is run along the frame here, and when it comes up in contact with the motor itself, it's really close to the brake calipers, and so because of that, there's definitely a risk of shearing if that wire were to become loose. On the first builds of the bike, those wires were held on via just a simple zip tie. It's an orange zip tie, and basically in the instruction manual they were telling you to check for that zip tie every time you ride. If you ever see that zip tie is gone, stop riding, because that zip tie is what is essentially holding that phase wire out of the way of the brake caliper. Again, a little homemade, a little Frankenstein of a solution, but it does work. Since then, they've replaced that with a motor spacer. So there's a small black metal spacer that sits in that same space where the zip tie was now. And it's a permanent solution to hold that phase wire off of the brake to make sure that you're not going to slice it or sever it. So I've actually gotten that spacer post hoc. I asked them to send me one, and I've installed that myself. It wasn't too difficult to install. It's worked really well. It's kept the phase wire out of the way of the brake caliper, and I really haven't had any issues since I've ridden it. So really happy that they were able to come out with that solution sort of after the fact. Because the bike is a lot safer now because of it. And if you do slice that phase wire, you're basically toast. There's really no way to fix this bike if you happen to slice that wire. So it's something that's really important to keep protected. So yeah, overall, I really, really love the ONYX. This has been a total game changer for me. Riding on two-stroke mopeds where you constantly have the fear of dropping a pipe or breaking down or having some issue. This bike really has been the best of both worlds. I have the speed and zippiness that I would get out of an electric car or a nice motorcycle, but I have the maintenance of something that is super minimal. The battery itself sits inside, it's a little suitcase. I can pull that out to reduce some weight if I'm trying to move the bike around or if I'm putting it in my basement for storage, something like that. But it is still a really heavy bike overall, much heavier than some of my other mopeds that I've owned. But it's such a head turner. It's so fast and fun. It looks so cool, and it's really just so functional and pure. And again, just it has that homemade kind of Mad Maxy vibe to it when you're riding on it. That it's just a blast. So if you're somebody who's confident that you can do a little bit of tinkering here and there, and you're willing to deal with a couple little tweaks and frustrations down the road, I think it's a great fit for somebody. But if you're somebody who has never owned a bike, doesn't know how to maintain, any kind of mechanical thing, if you're just not mechanically inclined, it is a bike that does require a little bit of wherewithal and understanding of how just basic things go together. So if you're not really confident in, how to adjust brakes, then, maybe this is a bike that's not really great for you. Maybe it's better to look at more of a name brand, Yamaha, some other scooter that's a little more refined in its build, because this is definitely just a little homemade. So some people really like that. I obviously really do, but there's definitely a lot of people I think that it might be a little too intimidating for, and would end up feeling like they got scammed out of a lot of money getting something that isn't fully flushed out. Whereas from my perspective, this is a $4,000 pseudo motorcycle that right out of the gate feels really fast, really nimble, really fun to ride, is a total head turner. And when you compare that to some of the other bikes out there, the vintage electric bike, which is twice as expensive but really only half as powerful, you compare it to the cake bike, which is the same amount of power but costs like 4 times as much. Small zero motorcycles, which offer a lot of the same features or even faster, but maybe in your state requires you to register it as a motorcycle, and they cost 3-4 times as much. Or an e-bike that maybe has a lot of power, but it's still only going to go 35 miles an hour. It's really nice that this is really blending the best of both worlds, both motorcycle and e-bicycle, into one, and it's just perfect for the urban riding experience. You have people that you're constantly afraid are zipping by you a little too fast when you're on an e-bicycle. This thing is going to be able to keep up with traffic in a way that an e-bicycle or even a vintage two-stroke moped can't. You feel a little bit bigger, a little bit taller on the road. You're a little more visible, not as visible as some big hog of a bicycle, a motorcycle I should say, but it does kind of command its own presence in a way that a lot of e-bicycles and small displacement bikes don't. Yeah, that's basically all I have to say about the bike. It's it's been a blast. So if you want to have a blast, then you should probably think about getting one. So I guess that's it. So thank you so much for sitting through this, listening to my talk, my conversation about the bike. And if you guys have any questions about the bike, if you want any of my personal anecdotes on a particular topic about it, let me know. I'm happy to answer questions in the comments. And yeah, if there's any more features of the bike that you'd like me to show in a preceding video, I'm happy to do that too. So just shoot me a note and let me know what you're looking for, and I can do my best to try and answer your questions open and honestly. But this is the ONYX RCR.